I'm Patrick Wheeler for the Center for Digital Strategies, and today I'm joined by Adam Golodner, a partner at Kaye Scholer and the leader of their global cybersecurity and policy group. Welcome, Adam. Can you tell me a little bit about your role at Kaye Scholer and how much infrastructure plays into your work there?
Sure. I'm leading a global team of attorneys that are focused on cyber issues generally. And I spent 10 years at Cisco running their global cyber policy before starting this practice at Kaye Scholer. And it's really, at the end of the day, all about infrastructure. I mean, the big picture cyber issue is the internet staying up or coming down? And when we talk today about an infrastructure that keeps growing into things like the Internet of Things, and we're moving from 5 billion devices being connected to 20 to 30 billion devices being connected. In my line of work, people really start to think about this concept of digital tsunami. And are all of these different pieces of what are now in a very extended global network. And once they start talking to each other, how do we really understand what they're saying to each other, what kind of information they're carrying? And are they going to be put together? I mean, this is the horrible of horribles, in some sort of automated, in effect, bot or being that can be used for harming not just the infrastructure, but the people who are connected to the infrastructure.
Yeah, and that's a good segue. You know, in the Brit series here at the Center for Digital Strategies this year, our overall theme is this idea of hyperconnectivity. So it's exactly what you're talking about. You know, connecting all these devices and linking everything together. Can you talk then a little bit then about the current state of our digital infrastructure? You talked about this coming tsunami. Are we ready?
Well, from the security perspective and the privacy perspective, we're getting ready. Okay. What's really nice about this, from one perspective, is that we've been through some pretty serious cyber events. Governments understand what other governments can do, and companies understand what governments and other companies can do. And we're, in my view, actually getting ahead of the curve in a way that we probably didn't at the very beginning of the internet. At least now people are cognizant of the issue and can start to build in methodologies for dealing with security and privacy issues as we grow this infrastructure. But more generally to your question, look, this hyperconnectivity is a great thing. I mean, we're going to be driving new business models, disintermediation of markets, shifting billions of dollars of value to companies and entities and probably countries that can take advantage of a new, much more efficient methodology for providing their services and their products. And so this is all good from the social media perspective for things like for the spread of ideas and voices. This is all good. So the big picture in all this is excellent. As we move along this excellent adventure, though, we do need to be cognizant of understanding what some of the unintended consequences can be.
So you talked a little bit about winners and losers, and that the field is playing. You know, the field is changing. Do you have an idea of who some of those winners might be and who some of those losers might end up being in the long run?
Yeah, I think the winners are going to be people who get this now. That not just the infrastructure is changing because of course it is, but the way in which they're going to deliver services is just fundamentally changing. And you know, it's interesting. You see companies that are in the delivery business now looking at drones, and you know, it's something that they recognize that this infrastructure is changing. There's a way to drive competitive advantage and efficiency, and they're moving. And I think the losers will be people, which has always been the case with technology. Losers will be people who don't understand that there's a transition and get ahead of that transition. If you're stuck, I mean, I remember back when, you know, I was before Cisco, I was up here at Dartmouth, and before that I was in the U.S. government, and one of the roles I had was the chief of staff of the antitrust division, and this was back in the 90s when the internet and web-based business was really rolling out. And there was some merger of two of the travel websites that was going on. And the travel agents complained bitterly about it because they thought that it would, in effect, hurt their business. Well, of course it did. It changed their business. And so that was not an anti-competitive merger, I think. I can't remember what we did with that one. But the point is that there's a history in technology of business changing. So the winners will be people who understand those transitions and act on them. I think the losers will be people who don't recognize it and keep doing business the same way. I think globally, you'll also have some countries that are winners and losers. And here's something that takes, that we should all be thinking about. The winners will be those countries that are more connected now as you get into being hyper-connected. Those that are just now becoming connected are going to either have to find a way to leapfrog to become hyper-connected, or they're going to be one or two steps, if not yards or meters, behind that change. And so I do think from a global perspective, and we think about both the global network and equality across the globe between countries and what that means for geopolitical issues, those countries who are further behind need to focus on this issue because they may fall further behind in economic development.
And that brings a good point globally. Each country seems to have their own sort of way of tackling these challenges with infrastructure. Can you talk a little bit about here in the U.S. what role our government should play in expanding or developing infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, here in the United States, since we since we broke up the old Ma Bell monopoly, in those marketplaces where there is not an economic reason to have economic regulation, those places where we over time have still had non-competitive markets, in certainly the spread of new devices in wireless and in some aspects of over-the-top multi-channel video, we've been certainly driven by market forces, which most people agree at the end of the day is the best way to drive infrastructure. So then the question is, are we still, first in the U.S., in markets that require some level of regulation in order to build out that infrastructure?
Shifting direction just briefly, so you lead Kaye Scholer's Global Cybersecurity and Privacy Group. Privacy and security seem to and the discussions always seem almost at odds in a lot of the debates that you hear about this. Can you talk about that balance between protecting our infrastructure and ensuring adequate privacy for individuals?
Sure. I actually am of the view that you can do both. So when I talk about this issue, I don't often talk about the balance between security and privacy because fundamentally you have to do both. So are there tensions between those two things? There are, but I don't think you can get mired in that. There are some things which you just have to do for national security purposes to keep both citizens and infrastructure and information safe on both sides. And that includes personal information. And what's really wonderful in part about the debate, at least from an American perspective, about the debate that came after the Snowden leaks, is that we in the United States have this wonderful thing called the Constitution. And we have this wonderful thing that is about the Fourth Amendment and restraints on the government having unreasonable searches and seizures of information about citizens. In most of the rest of the world, there are not those restraints on governments. And the discussion oftentimes is interesting because we have lots of different structures to keep the activities of the government in check, whether they be congressional or judicial or executive. And we can argue about whether we are too far one way with particular tools, but we have those structures. Most of the world, there are not those structures. And I think we really need to have a global discussion about really what the rules of the road should be in security and in privacy, and getting to both between governments and individuals and governments and corporations. We're just starting to have that discussion. I do think that the U.S. took the brunt of criticism about these programs, which in some sense is understandable because the U.S. Has particular heft in this domain. But the same kind of activity that happens in the U.S. sometimes happens in other countries, and sometimes in countries that are also concerned about this issue. So I think a fundamental siren issue for us over the next 10, 15, really 20 years is building out those rules of the road about activities both on the security side and the privacy side between countries and their citizens, countries and companies, companies and individuals, and what's okay and what's not okay. And at the end of the day, we're going to have to agree on these, I think. And for those countries that are not part of that family of agreement, so to speak, I think they'll find themselves out of the mainstream for a little bit of time, which I think has a nice effect over time, because most countries who want to be and are global players don't really like being outside of the commonly acceptable rules of behavior in society. And I think that's the world's gotten better that way. And so I think this will be really a siren issue for the for the foreseeable future.
So you talked about this role of the international landscape, if you will, of the state of security and privacy. And you mentioned sort of the interaction between government players and corporations, and we saw with the Sony hack that well, I guess it's not completely proven, but it appears to be that North Korea was sort of behind that. How is that tension between governments and individuals playing out in this space, and where do you see sort of the U.S. government stepping in those situations to provide that protection?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think people like to call to refer to Sony as a game changer. I'm not sure if it's a game changer. It might be. One of the things that's true is that the activity put together a lot of different methodologies that we've seen mostly in individual uses, whether it's destruction of machines, destruction of data, the exfiltration of data and making it public, the theft of intellectual property. We tend to see these in very specific activities and not always, hardly ever really put together in that way. So I do think it's something that has captured both the attention and imagination of people, as it should, and also the U.S. government. The U.S. government is working its way through this issue about what is the proper role of government to protect private companies in activities that run the gamut from theft to fraud to espionage to war. And in the traditional context, at least on the war and espionage side, the lanes have been pretty clear about what governments do. And on the national security side, if we feel some threat, we build bombers and aircraft carriers to help police those spaces and sometimes to take activities. Here, with the digital infrastructure, pretty much every little piece of the digital infrastructure is owned by somebody. So it is both the means and unfortunately the target for these activities. So I think the US government is looking for tools in the toolbox in order to set acceptable rules of the road by other governments for activities in cyberspace. And we saw 3 weeks ago the government create a new tool, which is sanction authority to sanction individuals and entities for significant cyber activity that's specifically focused on harm to critical infrastructure and the theft of intellectual property. And I think that is a significant tool because economic sanctions can be used to go after the same benefit that someone who steals intellectual property, for example, is trying to garner. If you steal intellectual property in another country in order to compete against US businesses and steal their latest innovation, to the extent that you can adversely affect their ability to capitalize on that stolen intellectual property, there's a very interesting symmetry there that actually makes sense to use economic sanctions against economic harm. And it also sets some stakes in the ground about what behavior is acceptable with regard to critical infrastructure and intellectual property for both individuals and entities. Now, the other interesting part of the US trying to build out this structure is that it applies to individuals and entities and people who help and benefit from that activity. So it goes up and down the supply chain a little bit, which will probably be powerful. So we'll have to wait to see how they're specifically used. We'll have to wait to see what other countries decide that this is a useful mechanism and decide whether they're going to join in the sanctions kind of regime. But broadly, the US is looking at tools like criminal prosecution, certainly building up defensive capabilities and military capabilities, trade remedies, and this new one, sanctions, and other tools in the toolbox. At the end of the day, I do think we want to get to this place where everyone agrees what the rules of the road are between the companies and governments to governments.
Great. So at Tuck, we are obviously here to educate future business leaders. Do you have any sort of last thoughts on advice for Tuck students going out into business from an information security or from an infrastructure perspective?
Sure. The first is follow your passion and follow your gut. If you think you have an interest in the digital infrastructure and how it plays out, if you think you have an interest in security or privacy and driving these next generation discussions, follow that passion. You never know where the road's going to take you. My own career has had a series of, I never thought I'd be doing that. And so I think that's always good to keep in mind and to just start taking those steps when you find something that you're passionate about. The other thing in today's world, which of course Tuck does so well, is if you're thinking about technology or infrastructure or security, you will need to be global. This is just a completely global and flat domain, and so be open to that and take advantage of opportunities if you go into companies that afford the opportunity to not just work on global issues, but to see the world. You learn so much by visiting China and by visiting India and by visiting Germany and South America. So you can study these things. You can figure out what you think your go-to-market strategy might be or what a proper government policy might be. But I've always found it very helpful to be on the ground, to experience it physically, to have conversations. It's the conversations, during a meeting and then after the meeting and at dinner that really can form both relationships that you understand people's views that sometimes are just coming from a different place. And if you're going to be in a discipline like technology or infrastructure or security, you need to understand where people are coming from. Once you understand where people are coming from, it's much easier to work through solutions.
Great. Well, Adam, I want to thank you on behalf of the Center for Digital Strategies for joining us today, and welcome back to Talk.
Thank you.